Some mistakes follow you, no matter how far you run or how deep you bury them. For 40-year-old cowboy Eli Mercer, that truth comes crawling back when he wakes up with a twisted mark carved across his face. He thinks it's just a bad dream until Doc Harrison takes one look and his hands start shaking. The old doctor survived the Civil War and 20 years on the frontier, but this mark terrifies him. He's seen it before, right before an entire mining camp disappeared. Now strange things are happening in Calico Ridge. Livestock vanish in the night. All the clocks stop at midnight. And the mark keeps growing, forcing Eli to remember things he buried long ago about a canyon he swore never to visit again. The town is in danger, but the real terror isn't what's coming for Calico Ridge. What did Eli do in that canyon that was so terrible he erased it from his own memory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eli Mercer's modest ranch, 3 miles outside the dusty frontier town of Calico Ridge. The land wasn't much to look at: a weathered cabin, a small corral, and 40 acres of stubborn grass that barely sustained his dozen head of cattle. But it was his, and more importantly, it was quiet. For 5 years now, quiet had been exactly what Eli needed. He stood at his wash basin, cold water dripping from his weathered hands as he stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The mark was still there, twisted and dark against his sunbeaten skin, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. In the harsh light of dawn, it looked even worse than it had the night before, like something had burrowed under his flesh and was trying to claw its way out. Eli had seen plenty of wounds in his 40 years. Bullet holes, knife cuts, burns from branding irons gone wrong. This was different. This felt alive. He pulled on his worn leather vest and headed outside to tend his animals. The routine had become sacred to him over the years: feed the horses, check the cattle, mend whatever fence the wind had knocked down overnight. Simple work for a man who'd once commanded troops in places most folks couldn't pronounce. Simple work that let him sleep at night without dreams of blood and smoke. But as he approached the corral, something was wrong. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Charity, stood perfectly still in the center of the enclosure. Her eyes were wide and white with terror, focused not on Eli, but on something behind him. The other animals pressed themselves against the far fence, trembling. Eli turned. Slowly. Nothing there but prairie grass and the distant mountains. Yet every instinct he'd honed in the war told him otherwise. Something was watching him. The ride into Calico Ridge took 20 minutes, along a rutted dirt road that wound between scrub oak and sandstone outcroppings. The town wasn't much, maybe 200 souls on a good day, with a main street that boasted a general store, a saloon, a church, and Doc Harrison's practice. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, which had made Eli's arrival 5 years ago a topic of conversation for months. He'd shown up in late autumn with nothing but his horse, a small bag of belongings, and enough gold to buy his land outright. No explanations, no stories about where he'd come from or what he'd done before. The townspeople had eventually stopped asking, accepting him as a quiet neighbor who kept to himself and never caused trouble. Doc Harrison's office sat at the end of Main Street, a narrow building with white-painted walls and a hand-carved sign that had weathered 20 Colorado winters. The old doctor had arrived in Calico Ridge not long after the war ended, carrying his own collection of secrets and a leather medical bag that had seen service at Gettysburg, Antietam, and a dozen other battles where boys had died far from home. Eli pushed through the heavy wooden door, setting off a small brass bell that announced his arrival. The waiting room was empty, except for a single chair and a table stacked with year-old newspapers. The smell of carbolic acid and something else, something medicinal and sharp, filled the air. "Doc?" Eli called out. "Back here, Eli. Come on through." Doctor Samuel Harrison looked older than his 58 years. The war had aged him, as it had aged all the men who'd spent 4 years patching up boys who should have been home, helping with harvest instead of bleeding out in Virginia mud. His hair had gone completely white, and deep lines mapped the geography of every difficult decision he'd made with a bone saw and a bottle of whiskey for anesthesia. But his hands were steady, and his eyes were sharp. Until he got a good look at Eli's face. The color drained from Doc's weathered cheeks. His hands, which had never trembled while digging shrapnel from a soldier's chest, began to shake like autumn leaves. The leather-bound medical journal he'd been writing in slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. "Dear God in heaven," Doc whispered, "where did you get that mark?" "Woke up with it yesterday morning. Figured maybe a spider bit me, or I scraped myself on something during the night. But it's gotten worse." Doc approached slowly, as if Ellie might explode at any sudden movement. He pulled a magnifying glass from his vest pocket and leaned in close, studying the twisted pattern that seemed to writhe under his examination. "This isn't a bite, Eli. This isn't any kind of wound I've seen in 20 years of frontier medicine." Doc's voice was barely above a whisper. "How do you feel? Any fever? Nausea? Strange dreams?" "Dreams, yes. Fragments of things I can't quite remember when I wake up. And the animals are spooked around me." Doc walked to a wooden cabinet and retrieved a leather journal, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. He flipped through pages covered in precise handwriting and detailed sketches, stopping at an entry near the middle of the book. "Look at this," he said, turning the journal toward Eli. The page contained a detailed drawing of a mark identical to the one on Eli's face. Below it, in Doc's careful script, were notes dated 15 years earlier. "Silverbrook Camp," Doc read aloud. "Mining operation 43 miles northeast of here. 17 miners, 3 women, 2 children. All found dead in their beds one morning. No signs of violence, no apparent cause, but every single one of them bore this mark." Eli studied the drawing, a chill working its way down his spine despite the warm morning air. "What killed them?" "I never figured that out." "The territorial governor ordered the camp abandoned and the bodies burned. Said it was disease, probably cholera. But I'd seen cholera, Eli. This was something else entirely." Doc closed the journal and sat heavily in his chair. "I've been a doctor for 30 years. Served in the bloodiest war this country's ever seen. I've watched men die from bullets, disease, infections, and pure despair. But those people in Silverbrook, there was something about their faces when we found them, like they'd seen something so terrible it stopped their hearts. And now I've got the same mark." "Yes, you do. And if I'm right about what this means, we don't have much time." Outside Doc's office, Calico Ridge was waking up to another ordinary day. Martha Henley swept the porch of her boarding house while her cat sunned itself on the railing. Jim Fletcher loaded supplies into his wagon at the general store, preparing for the weekly delivery run to the outlying ranches. Children played in the dusty street, their laughter echoing off the weathered storefronts. None of them knew that their clocks had all stopped at midnight. None of them had noticed that the Henderson family's prize bull had been found that morning, arranged in a perfect circle with 7 other dead cattle, all pointing toward the mountains. None of them could see what. Eli was beginning to understand that something dark was stirring in the high country, something that had been waiting 15 years for the right moment to finish what it had started. In Silverbrook Camp. As Eli emerged from Doc's office, the mark on his face pulsed once, sending a jolt of pain through his skull. For just a moment, the peaceful street before him flickered, replaced by an image of canyon walls stained with blood and echoing with screams that had no source. Then it was gone, leaving only the taste of copper in his mouth and the absolute certainty that his 5 years of quiet were over. The past had found him in Calico Ridge, and this time, there would be no running from it. Doc Harrison's hands trembled as he reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface carved with symbols that looked older than the town itself. Inside, wrapped in faded velvet, lay a daguerreotype photograph that had yellowed with age. This was taken 3 days before Silverbrook disappeared, Doc said, placing the image carefully on his desk. The territorial photographer was documenting mining operations for some government report. Eli studied the photograph. 22 people stood in front of a collection of rough wooden buildings, squinting into the camera with the serious expressions, common to early photography. But what made his blood run cold were the marks. 7 of the people in the photograph bore the same twisted symbol that now decorated his own face. "My God," Eli whispered. "They all had it, not all. Just the ones who died first. The others, the photograph shows them healthy. But when we found the camp, every person bore the mark." Doc's voice cracked slightly. "Whatever this thing is, Eli, it spreads." As if summoned by their conversation, the mark on Eli's face suddenly blazed with heat. The pain was so intense he staggered backward, knocking over Doc's medicine cabinet. Glass vials shattered against the floor, filling the room with the smell of carbolic acid and laudanum. But the pain brought something else, a flash of memory so vivid it felt like living it again. Canyon walls rising like cathedral spires, the sound of horses screaming, smoke rising from fires that burned things no fire should burn. And through it all, a voice speaking words in a language that predated English, Spanish, or any tongue that belonged to the white man's world. The vision lasted only seconds. But when it ended, Eli found himself on his knees, blood trickling from his nose. "It's getting stronger," Doc observed grimly. "The connection, whatever it is, it's pulling you back to wherever this started." Eli wiped the blood away with his sleeve and stood slowly. "You said the camp was 43 miles northeast. There are canyons in that direction." A commotion outside cut him off. Shouting voices, the sound of running feet, and beneath it all, a woman's scream that seemed to go on far too long. They rushed outside to find half the town gathered in the street. At the center of the crowd, Sarah Chun knelt beside her horse, tears streaming down her face. The animal lay on its side, clearly dead. But what held everyone's attention was the pattern carved into its hide, symbols that seemed to move and shift when viewed directly. Sarah Chun was new to Calico Ridge, having arrived just 6 months earlier to serve as the town's first real schoolteacher. She'd come from San Francisco with letters of recommendation and a quiet determination to bring education to the frontier. At 28, she was considered an old maid by many standards, but her intelligence and gentle manner had quickly won over most of the townspeople. "It was fine this morning," she sobbed. "I fed her, brushed her down, everything normal. Then I came back from school and found her like this." Marshal Wade Garrett pushed through the crowd, his weathered face grim. Garrett had been keeping law in small frontier towns for 15 years, and he'd seen his share of strange things. Cattle rustlers who left no tracks, men who walked into the desert and came back speaking in tongues, women who claimed their husbands had been replaced by something that merely looked like them. But this was different. "Anybody see who did this?" Garrett asked, knowing even as he spoke that no human hand had carved those symbols. "No one did this, Marshal," Doc Harrison said quietly. He'd followed Eli outside and now stood at the edge of the crowd, his medical journal clutched against his chest. "This is the same thing that happened at Silverbrook Camp." A murmur ran through the gathered townspeople. Some of the older residents remembered the stories about the mining camp, though most had dismissed them as frontier legends designed to scare children and greenhorns. "Doc, that's just old wives' tales," protested Jim Fletcher, the store owner. "Probably some drifters playing a sick joke." But even as he spoke, other voices began to rise from the crowd. Mrs. Patterson's chickens had been found arranged in a perfect spiral behind her house. The schoolhouse bell had been ringing by itself every hour on the hour since midnight, and young Tommy Morrison swore he'd seen shapes moving in the cemetery that walked upright but cast no shadows. Sarah looked up from her dead horse and for the first time noticed Eli standing at the back of the crowd. Her eyes widened as she saw the mark on his face, and she scrambled backward as if he'd struck her. "You," she whispered. "You did this." The crowd turned to look at Eli, and he saw fear replace curiosity in their faces. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, the mysterious cowboy with the strange mark suddenly seemed less like a harmless hermit and more like the cause of their troubles. "Now hold on," Doc Harrison said, stepping forward. "Eli's no more responsible for this than any of us. He's got the mark, yes, but that makes him a victim, not a perpetrator." "Then explain it," demanded Marshal Garrett. "Explain why all this started happening right after he showed up in town with that thing on his face." Eli felt the weight of their stares, the fear and suspicion that could turn neighbors into a mob with very little provocation. He'd seen it before, in other places, during darker times. But before he could respond, another wave of pain crashed through his skull, and with it came another flash of memory. Soldiers in blue uniforms. Orders barked in harsh voices. A Native American village burning while women and children screamed. And standing in the center of it all, a younger version of himself, following orders that no decent man should follow. When the vision ended, he realized he'd spoken aloud. "Broken Arrow Canyon," he said, his voice hoarse. "It happened at Broken Arrow Canyon." The crowd fell silent. Even the children stopped their whimpering. "There is no place called Broken Arrow Canyon," Marshal Garrett said slowly. "There was," Eli replied, 15 years ago, before the army decided it needed to be forgotten." Sarah Chun stood slowly, wiping tears from her face. Despite her fear, something in Eli's voice, pain, regret, old grief, made her listen instead of run. "What happened there?" she asked. Eli looked at her, then at Doc Harrison, then at the faces of the townspeople who had accepted him as a neighbor for 5 years. He knew that once he answered her question, there would be no going back to his quiet life on the ranch. The truth had a way of demanding payment, and the bill for Broken Arrow Canyon was 15 years overdue. Something that should never have happened, he said finally. Something that 37 people died trying to stop. And apparently, something that isn't finished with me yet. The mark on his face pulsed once, as if agreeing with his assessment. In the distance, thunder rumbled from a cloudless sky, and every clock in Calico Ridge began striking 13. That evening, Eli returned to his cabin with the weight of the town's suspicion heavy on his shoulders. The ride home had been silent, except for the whisper of wind through the grass and the occasional call of a night bird. But as he unsaddled Charity, he noticed something that made his blood run. Cold hoof prints in the dirt around his cabin that belonged to no horse he'd ever seen. The prints were too large, shaped wrong, and they glowed with a faint phosphorescence in the gathering. Darkness fell inside the cabin. Eli lit the oil lamp and sat at his small wooden table, staring at the rough floorboards beneath his feet. Somewhere under there, wrapped in oilcloth and buried deep, were the only remnants of the man he'd been before Calico Ridge. For 5 years, he'd left them undisturbed, hoping that ignoring the past would make it stay buried. The mark on his face pulsed, and he knew those days were over. He pried up 3 floorboards with his knife, revealing a cavity he'd carved into the earth beneath his cabin. Inside lay a wooden box, its surface scarred by weather and time. With trembling fingers, he lifted it out and set it on the table. The box contained a cavalry saber, its blade still sharp despite years of neglect. The hilt was wrapped in leather that had once been white but had long since darkened with sweat and blood. Etched into the crossguard, were the words, "First Colorado Volunteer Cavalry," and below that, in smaller script, "Captain E. Mercer." He'd been a different man when he'd carried this sword. Younger, certainly, but more than that, he'd believed in things then. Duty, honor, the righteousness of following orders, no matter how difficult they might be. Broken Arrow Canyon had taught him that some orders were worth dying to disobey. As his fingers closed around the familiar grip, another wave of memories washed over him. Not the fragmented flashes he'd been experiencing, but a clear, sustained vision of the events that had changed him forever. It was October 1860, and Captain Eli Mercer was leading 2 companies of Colorado cavalry on what the territorial government had called a peaceful relocation mission. The Cheyenne village at Broken Arrow Canyon was to be moved to a new reservation further east, away from the gold mining operations that were bringing wealth to Colorado territory. But when they'd arrived at the canyon, they'd found something that wasn't on any of their maps or in any of their orders. The village wasn't just a collection of teepees and cooking fires. It was a sacred site, built around a circle of ancient stones that predated the Cheyenne by centuries. The stones hummed with an energy that made the horses nervous and set the men's teeth on edge. Chief Running Bear, the village leader, was a man of perhaps 60 years with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who had spent his life making difficult decisions. He had approached Eli under a white flag, speaking in careful English he'd learned from missionaries. "This place is older than your maps, Captain," Running Bear had said. "Older than your government's claims. The stones you see here are guardians, keeping something asleep that should never wake. Move us if you must, but leave the sacred circle intact." Eli had wanted to listen. Every instinct he'd developed in 10 years of military service told him that Chief Running Bear was speaking the truth. But his orders were specific: clear the canyon completely for mining operations. No exceptions. The memory shifted, becoming more painful. The argument with his lieutenant, a young man named Morrison, who'd been eager to prove himself. The increasing pressure from the territorial governor's representative, a thin man in an expensive suit who spoke of progress and civilization, while counting the gold that would flow from the canyon mines. And finally, the moment when everything went wrong. Knock at his cabin door jerked Eli back to the present. He set the sword aside and opened the door to find Sarah Chun standing on his porch, a leather satchel slung over her shoulder and determination written across her face. "Miss Chun," he said, surprised. "It's late to be riding alone." "I need to understand what's happening," she said without preamble. "My horse is dead. The children in my classroom are having nightmares about things that haven't happened yet. And you're the only person in town who seems to know why." Eli hesitated. Getting her involved would put her in danger, but the mark on his face was spreading. He could feel it reaching toward his ear, following the line of his jaw. Soon it would cover half his face, and if Doc Harrison was right about Silverbrook Camp, that meant he didn't have much time. "Come in," he said finally. Sarah entered the cabin and immediately noticed the sword on the table. Her eyes widened as she read the inscription. "You are an officer," she said. "In the Colorado Cavalry was a long time ago." Eli moved the sword aside and gestured for her to sit. "What do you know about Broken Arrow Canyon?" "Nothing. I've never heard the name before today. But I spent the evening going through the school's old books, looking for any reference to unusual events in this area." She opened her satchel and withdrew several leather-bound volumes. "I found mentions of a Cheyenne settlement that was relocated in 1860, but no details about where it was located or what happened to the people." "The details were classified," Eli said grimly. "The territorial government didn't want anyone asking uncomfortable questions about their methods." Sarah studied his face in the lamplight, taking in the twisted mark that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "You were there, at this canyon. I led the expedition that destroyed it." The words hung between them like a confession at trial. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "Tell me," she said finally. So Eli told her about Chief Running Bear and his warnings about the sacred stones, about the pressure from politicians who saw only gold where others saw holy ground, about the moment when young Lieutenant Morrison had lost his temper and struck an elderly Cheyenne woman who'd been too slow to move away from the stone circle, and about what happened when the sacred stones were broken. The ground split open, Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something came out, not an animal, not human, but something in between. It killed 17 of my men before we managed to drive it back into whatever hole it had crawled out of. But not before it marked us. The mark on your face? 37 people bore this mark when we left Broken Arrow Canyon. Soldiers, civilians, even some of the Cheyenne who tried to help us contain what we'd released. One by one, over the next few months, they started dying. Always in their sleep, always with that look of absolute terror on their faces. Sarah leaned forward. "But you survived." "I ran, changed my name, moved to California, tried to disappear. When I heard about Silverbrook Camp, when Doc Harrison described what happened there, I knew it was starting again. The thing we woke up wasn't finished with us." "Us?" Eli met her eyes. "I'm not the last one, Miss Chun. There were others who survived, others who ran like I did. But something's calling us back now, all of us. I can feel them moving, drawn to this place, like iron. Filings to a magnet." As if summoned by his words, hoofbeats sounded outside the cabin. Not the familiar rhythm of a single horse, but the measured cadence of multiple riders moving in formation. Military precision. Eli grabbed his sword and moved to the window. In the moonlight, he could see them 5 riders approaching his cabin. Their faces hidden by shadow, but their bearing unmistakably familiar. Men who'd learned to ride in formation, who'd spent years following orders and sleeping on hard ground. Men who bore the same mark he did. "They're here," he said softly. "The others are coming home." The 5 riders dismounted in front of Eli's cabin with the quiet efficiency of men accustomed to danger, even in the uncertain moonlight. Eli recognized them all, faces that had aged 15 years but retained the hard lines that came from witnessing the impossible. The first through his door was Thomas Briggs, formerly Sergeant Briggs of the 1st Colorado. The mark on his face covered his left cheek completely, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who hadn't slept peacefully in years. Behind him came James Walsh, who'd been their best tracker, and David Murphy, a quiet Irishman who'd joined the cavalry to escape a murder charge in Chicago. The last 2 were harder to look at. Private Harrison Wells had been barely 18 at Broken Arrow Canyon, a farm boy from Kansas who thought military service would make him a man. Now he was thin and pale, the mark stretching from his temple to his jaw like a branded accusation. Beside him stood Nathan Cross, their former chaplain, whose faith hadn't survived what he'd seen that day in the canyon. "Captain," Briggs said, his voice carrying the same respect it had 15 years ago. "Good to see you're still alive." "Wish I could say the same for all of us," Eli replied, noting the empty spaces where other men should have been standing. "How many are left?" "Just us 5 and you," Walsh answered. "The others, Kowalski, died in Denver last winter." "Found him?" "In an alley behind a saloon. Same look on his face as the ones from Silverbrook. Henderson lasted until 3 months ago, then walked into the Missouri River with stones in his pockets." Sarah had pressed herself against the far wall of the cabin, overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of these haunted men. But Eli noticed she was taking notes in a small journal, recording everything with the thoroughness of a trained teacher. "Why now?" he asked. "Why are we all being drawn back after 15 years? Chaplain Cross spoke for the first time, his voice hollow. "Because it's finished feeding on the dead, Captain. It needs the living now." From his coat, Cross withdrew an object. That made Eli's breath catch in his throat. It was a bone whistle, carved from what looked like a human femur and decorated with symbols that seemed to squirm in the lamplight. The same symbols that had been carved into Sarah's horse. "Found this in my room 3 nights ago," Cross said. "Along with these." He tossed a collection of yellowed photographs onto Eli's table. They showed the Cheyenne village at Broken Arrow Canyon before the cavalry had arrived, peaceful scenes of daily life. Children playing, women preparing food, men working with horses and tools. But in every photograph, certain individuals were marked with the same twisted symbol that now decorated the faces of the surviving soldiers. "The Cheyenne knew," Eli whispered. "They knew what was coming. Chief Running Bear tried to warn us," Sergeant Briggs said bitterly. "Told us the stones kept something sleeping, something that had been bound there since before his grandfather's grandfather was born, but we had our orders." Sarah looked up from her notes. "What exactly did you wake up in that canyon?" The men exchanged glances, and Eli saw the same reluctance to speak that had kept them all silent for 15 years. Some truths were too large, too terrible to put into words. "We called it the hunger," Private Wells said finally, his young voice made old by what he'd witnessed. "Because that's all it was, an endless need to consume. Not food, not water. It fed on life itself, on the essence of what makes a person human." "And the mark?" Sarah pressed. "A claim," Cross answered. "Like a brand on cattle. It marked us as future meals, but it needed us alive first. Alive and guilty. The guilt makes the feeding stronger." Outside the cabin, the wind had picked up, carrying with it sounds that didn't belong to any Colorado night whispers in a language that predated English. The distant sound of drums that beat in rhythm with their hearts. And underneath it all, something that might have been laughter, if laughter could be made of malice and ancient hunger. Eli moved to his window and saw lights moving in the distance. Dozens of them, approaching Calico Ridge in a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. "It's not just calling us back," he said grimly. "It's calling everything back." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "The dead from Silverbrook Camp, the Cheyenne who died trying to stop us. Maybe even some of our own boys who didn't make it out of the canyon." Eli turned to face the group. 15 years it's been growing stronger, feeding on guilt and death. Now it's strong enough to raise an army. Sergeant Briggs drew his service revolver and checked the cylinder. "Then we'd better warn the town." "They won't believe us," Walsh said. "Hell, I barely believe it myself, and I was there." "They'll believe when they see what's coming down from the mountains," Eli replied. He looked at Sarah, who was still scribbling furiously in her journal. "Miss Chun, you need to leave. Ride to the next town. Send telegrams to Denver and the territorial capital. Tell them." "No," Sarah interrupted, closing her journal with a snap. "I'm not running. These people are my responsibility. The children in my school, the families who trusted me to educate their sons and daughters. If something's coming for Calico Ridge, then I'll face it here." "This isn't your fight," Private Wells said. "It became my fight when that thing killed my horse and started haunting my students' dreams." Sarah's voice carried a strength that reminded Eli of another woman who'd refused to abandon her people, Chief Running Bear's daughter, who died trying to protect the sacred stones. Cross held up the bone whistle, studying it in the lamplight. There might be a way to stop it. In the old Cheyenne stories, the creature was bound once before. The stones at Broken Arrow weren't just markers. They were a prison. "The stones we destroyed following our orders," Eli said bitterly. "But not all of them. The center stone, the one Chief Running Bear died protecting, it cracked but didn't break. If we could find it, repair it somehow, that would mean going back to the canyon," Briggs interrupted. "Back to where it all started. Where it's strongest." Walsh added. Eli looked around the cabin at these men who'd followed him into hell once before. They were older now, marked by years of guilt and nightmares, but they were still soldiers. And soldiers knew that sometimes the only way out of hell was to march straight through it. "Then that's where we'll go," he said simply. "Back to Broken Arrow Canyon. Back to finish what we started 15 years ago." The bone whistling across his hands suddenly began to emit a low, keening sound, not blown by any human breath, but vibrating with its own malevolent energy. Outside, the approaching lights had reached the outskirts of Calico Ridge, and the first screams began to echo through the night air. The dead had come home, and they were hungry. The screams from town cut through the night like broken glass, driving the group from Eli's cabin toward whatever hell was unfolding in Calico Ridge. As they rode, Eli's memories came flooding back in vivid, painful detail, not the fragmented flashes he'd been experiencing, but a complete recollection of that terrible day 15 years ago. It had been Lieutenant Morrison who'd struck the first blow. The young officer, frustrated by the Cheyennes' refusal to abandon their sacred circle, had raised his rifle butt and brought it down on the head of an elderly woman who'd been kneeling in prayer beside the stones. The crack of her skull breaking had been the sound that changed everything. Chief Running Bear had moved faster than any man his age should have been able to, placing himself between Morrison and the fallen woman. But the damage was done. The sacred circle, powered by centuries of ritual and reverence, had been violated by an act of senseless violence. The ground had split open with a sound like the world tearing in half. What emerged wasn't a demon in the Christian sense that Chaplain Cross might have recognized, or a beast that could be shot and killed like the wolves that plagued frontier settlements. It was something older, something that existed in the spaces between human understanding. The Cheyenne had a word for it, Wendigo, but even that was inadequate. This was the original hunger, the first and most terrible need that had driven primitive humans to acts of cannibalism and worse. It was what made manifest, need given form and malice, and it had marked them all. Now, as they approached Calico Ridge, Eli could see that the dead lights weren't fires at all. They were the phosphorescent glow of decomposing flesh animated by something that had no right to move. The missing miners from Silverbrook Camp walked again, their bodies preserved by 15 years in mountain caves, their eyes burning with borrowed malevolence. "Dear God," Sergeant Briggs whispered as they reached the outskirts of town. Main Street had become a battlefield. Marshal Garrett had organized what defense he could, positioning men behind overturned wagons and water troughs, but their bullets passed harmlessly through targets that should have fallen. Doc Harrison moved between the injured, his medical bag clutched in hands that no longer shook. Crisis had steadied them, but it was the children who broke Eli's heart. They stood in perfect formation in the town square, their eyes blank and unseeing, while something that had once been human conducted them like a choir. The thing wore the remnants of a mining foreman's clothes, and half its face had been eaten away by time and whatever had killed it at Silverbrook. "Miss Patterson," Sarah whispered, recognizing one of her students among the mesmerized children. "Little Tommy Morrison." Eli's blood ran cold at the name. Tommy Morrison, Lieutenant Morrison's son, born after the Canyon Massacre, raised by his widowed mother, who'd never known the full truth of what had happened to her husband. "It's not random," he said, understanding flooding through him. "It's calling the bloodlines, the descendants of everyone who was there." Chaplain Cross pulled the bone whistle from his coat, and immediately the thing conducting the children turned toward them, its remaining eye fixed on Cross with the intensity of a predator recognizing prey. "We need to get to the sacred stones," Cross said urgently. "The original circle at Broken Arrow Canyon. It's the only place we can end this." "Those stones are 40 miles from here," Wasp protested. "We'll never make it with that thing hunting us." "Then we make our stand here," Eli decided. "In the town with these people." He spurred his horse toward the improvised barricades where Marshal Garrett was trying to maintain order. The lawman looked up as Eli approached, his face grim with the kind of resignation that came from fighting an unwinnable battle. "Captain Mercer," Garrett said, and Eli realized the marshal had recognized his military bearing. "I don't suppose you've got any experience with situations like this." "More than I'd like to admit," Eli replied. "But first, we need to get those children away from that thing." Sarah had already dismounted and was moving toward the town square, her teacher's instincts overriding her fear. "Children," she called out, her voice carrying the authority that had kept classrooms in line from San Francisco to the frontier. "Children, look at me." Some of the blank-eyed youngsters turned toward her voice, confusion replacing the terrible emptiness in their faces. The thing that had been conducting them let out a shriek of rage and began moving toward Sarah with inhuman speed. Eli's cavalry saber sang as he drew it from its sheath. The blade had been forged in Pennsylvania, blessed by a Union chaplain, and had tasted the blood of men who died for causes both noble and terrible. But as it met the creature's claws, sparks flew that were neither steel on steel nor the clash of earthly weapons. "The sword recognizes it," Cross shouted over the sound of battle. "Iron forged in righteousness, carried by a man seeking redemption. It can hurt the thing." Behind them, the other survivors had engaged the walking dead of Silverbrook Camp. Their military training served them well even against impossible enemies. They maintained formation, covered each other's flanks, and fought with a disciplined courage of men who'd faced death before. But there were too many of the dead, and more were emerging from the darkness beyond town. Soon they would be overwhelmed. Sarah had managed to break the creature's hold on most of the children, sending them running toward their parents' arms. But young Tommy Morrison remained transfixed, and the thing that wore a dead foreman's face was using him as a shield. "Let the boy go," Eli commanded, his sword raised between them. The creature spoke then, and its voice was the sound of wind through empty graves. "He belongs to us, Captain. His father's debt passes to the son, as does yours, as does all of your sins. We have waited long enough to collect." Morrison acted on his own, Eli said. "The boy is innocent." "Innocent?" The thing laughed, a sound like bones breaking. "You led them there, Captain. Your orders, your command, your responsibility. 37 lives lost because you chose duty over wisdom." The accusation hit harder than any physical blow because it was true. He had led the expedition. He had chosen to follow orders rather than listen to Chief Running Bear's warnings. And when the sacred stones were broken and the hunger was released, it had been his failure of leadership that cost so many lives. But as he looked at Tommy Morrison's blank, terrified face, Eli realized something that 15 years of guilt had obscured. Taking responsibility didn't mean accepting blame forever. Sometimes it meant fighting to make things right. "You're correct," he said to the creature. "It was my command, my responsibility, which means ending this is my responsibility too." He raised his sword higher, and for the first time since Broken Arrow Canyon, Captain Eli Mercer felt like a leader worth following. The battle for Calico Ridge had begun in earnest, and the outcome would determine whether the hunger that had slept beneath sacred stones would feast again or finally face the justice it had avoided for 15 long years. The battle raged through the night, transforming Calico Ridge from a peaceful frontier town into something resembling the war zones Eli had known during his military service. But this was worse than any conventional conflict bullets passed harmlessly through enemies that should have fallen, and the dead fought with a coordination that spoke of malevolent intelligence directing their movements by dawn. The survivors had barricaded themselves in the schoolhouse, the most defensible building in town. Sarah had insisted on it, arguing that the place where children learned to read and write and dream of better futures was the appropriate fortress from which to fight for those futures. 17 townspeople remained alive, including Doc Harrison, Marshall Garrett, and most of Sarah's students. They huddled in the classroom while Eli and his former soldiers maintained watch at the windows, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were only postponing the inevitable. "We can't hold them much longer," Sergeant Briggs reported, checking his dwindling ammunition. "They're not getting tired, and we are." Through the window, Eli could see the creatures that had once been the miners of Silverbrook Camp arranging themselves in the street. They stood in perfect formation, waiting with the patience of the dead, while their phosphorescent forms cast an eerie glow over the abandoned town. "There's something different about them now," Private Wells observed. "They're not attacking anymore. It's like they're waiting for something." Chaplain Cross, who had been studying the bone whistle in the pale morning light, looked up with understanding dawning on his weathered features. "They're waiting for the rest of us to die. The hunger doesn't just want to kill us. It wants to turn us into part of its army." From his pocket, Cross withdrew an object that made everyone in the room fall silent. It was a ceremonial peace pipe, its stem carved from white oak, and its bowl made from a red stone that seemed to glow with inner warmth. The pipe was decorated with symbols that were clearly Native American in origin, but somehow they seemed familiar to everyone present. "This belonged to Chief Running Bear," Cross explained. "I took it from his body after everything went wrong at the canyon. I've carried it for 15 years, telling myself it was a war trophy, but I think he meant for us to find it." Sarah leaned forward, her teacher's instincts recognizing the significance of the artifact. "What does it do?" According to the stories the Cheyenne told, it was used to commune with the spirits of the ancestors, to ask for guidance when the living world couldn't provide answers. Cross's voice was heavy with old guilt. Running Bear tried to use it that day, tried to speak with the ancient ones who had first bound the hunger beneath the sacred stones. "And?" Marshal Garrett prompted. "Lieutenant Morrison shot him before he could complete the ritual." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Morrison had been young, scared, and angry, but his action had prevented the one chance they'd had to avoid the catastrophe that followed. Doc Harrison, who had been tending to a wounded townsman, looked up from his patient. "So we complete the ritual now. Here, use the pipe to contact these ancestor spirits and ask for their help." "It's not that simple," Cross replied. "The ritual requires a sacred space and specific knowledge that died with Chief Running Bear. Plus, I'm not sure the ancestors would listen to the men who killed their descendant. They'll listen to me." Everyone turned toward the voice. Standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse was an elderly Native American man, his long white hair braided with feathers and his weathered face marked by decades of sun and wind. He wore traditional Cheyenne clothing, but his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had witnessed the worst of both worlds, the white man's and his own people's. "Who are you?" Eli asked, his hand instinctively moving to his sword. "I am Joseph." "Running Bear," the old man replied, his English accented but clear. "Son of the chief you killed 15 years ago. I have been waiting for this day, waiting for the marked ones to return so that my father's work could finally be finished." Sarah stood slowly, her journal clutched in her hands. "You knew we would come back? The hunger calls all debts due eventually," Joseph said, entering the schoolhouse without fear despite being surrounded by armed men. "My father saw this day in his visions before your soldiers arrived at our canyon. He knew the sacred stones would be broken, knew that some of you would survive to carry the mark, and knew that one day the debt would have to be paid in full." He approached Chaplain Cross and extended his hand toward the peace pipe. "May I?" Cross hesitated for a moment, then handed over the artifact that had haunted him for 15 years. Joseph accepted it with the reverence due a sacred object, cradling it gently in weathered palms. "My father died trying to protect the binding that kept the hunger imprisoned," Joseph continued. "But his death wasn't meaningless. It created a new kind of binding, one forged from sacrifice and maintained by guilt. That's why you men have lived these 15 years in torment. Your suffering has been feeding the prison, keeping the creature weak. Then why is it free now? Walsh demanded. Because guilt alone cannot hold such a thing forever. Eventually, the debt must be paid with more than suffering. It must be paid with justice. Joseph moved to the center of the room and sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. He began loading the pipe with what looked like ordinary tobacco mixed with herbs Eli didn't recognize. But as he worked, the schoolhouse seemed to change around them. The morning light grew warmer, the air cleaner, and the oppressive weight of supernatural malevolence that had pressed down on them all night began to lift slightly. The ritual my father tried to complete would have strengthened the binding, Joseph explained as he worked. But there is another way, a way to not just imprison the hunger, but to destroy it completely. How? Sarah asked. Joseph looked directly at Eli, his dark eyes holding depths of both sorrow and hope. The creature feeds on guilt, on the knowledge that good men can do terrible things when they follow evil orders. But there is something stronger than guilt, Captain Mercer. Something that can starve the hunger until it fades away completely. What? Redemption freely chosen. Justice willingly served. The chance for a guilty man to become the person he was meant to be before fear and duty twisted his path. Outside, the creatures of Silverbrook Camp began to move again, sensing that something was changing within the schoolhouse. Their phosphorescent forms pressed against the windows, and their hollow voices rose in a keening wail that spoke of ancient malice and endless need. But for the first time since the mark had appeared on his face, Eli felt something other than guilt and fear. He felt hope. The path to redemption would lead back to Broken Arrow Canyon, back to the sacred stones that had been broken by violence and ignorance. But this time, he wouldn't be following orders from politicians who saw only gold where others saw holy ground. This time, he would be following the wisdom of a father, teaching his son how to set right an ancient wrong. Joseph Running Bear lit the peace pipe with a wooden match, and immediately the schoolhouse filled with smoke that smelled of sage, sweetgrass, and something else, something that spoke of vast spaces and ancient wisdom. As the smoke curled around them, the walls seemed to fade, replaced by visions of the past that played out like scenes from a tragic theater. But what Eli saw in those visions wasn't the version of events he'd carried in his memory for 15 years. In his recollections, the Colorado Cavalry had been following legitimate orders to relocate a Cheyenne village that was interfering with mining operations. The massacre at Broken Arrow Canyon had been a tragic accident, the result of young Lieutenant Morrison's hothead actions escalating a tense but manageable situation. The smoke visions told a different story entirely. Look closely, Captain. Joseph's voice seemed to come from far away, though he sat only a few feet distant. See what your guilt has hidden from your own memory. In the swirling smoke, Eli saw himself as he'd been 15 years ago, a career soldier who'd spent a decade following orders without question, who believed that military duty was the highest form of service a man could offer his country. He watched his younger self meet with Territorial Governor Crawford and his assistant, a thin man in an expensive suit who'd introduced himself as representing interested parties in Washington. But now, through the clarity the sacred smoke provided, Eli could see what he'd missed at the time: Governor Crawford's nervousness. The way the thin man's eyes never quite met his. The carefully worded orders that gave them broad discretion in dealing with any resistance to relocation. We need that land cleared completely, the thin man had said. The geological surveys show significant mineral deposits, but only if we can access the entire canyon system. No exceptions, no sacred sites left undisturbed. The territory's future depends on this operation moving forward. What about the Cheyenne? Eli had asked. Relocate them if they cooperate. If they don't, the thin man had shrugged. Use your discretion, Captain. These are dangerous times on the frontier. Accidents happen. In the present, Sarah gasped as she saw the same visions. They wanted you to kill them. The massacre wasn't an accident, it was the plan all along. But the revelations didn't stop there. As the smoke continued to swirl, Eli saw more meetings, more conversations, more carefully planted suggestions that the Cheyenne village represented a threat to territorial security. He saw Governor Crawford signing papers that authorized maximum force in clearing the canyon. He saw the thin man whose real name, the smoke revealed, was Harrison Blackwood, representing a consortium of Eastern mining interests, counting out gold coins while discussing the Cheyenne problem. "Dear God," Chaplain Cross whispered, "we were set up. They knew exactly what would happen when they sent us to that canyon with those orders." But the most shocking revelation came when the smoke showed them Doc Harrison, not as the elderly frontier physician they knew, but as a younger man in a military uniform, serving as the territorial government's medical advisor. Eli watched in stunned disbelief as the younger Doc Harrison met with Governor Crawford and Blackwood, discussing how to cover up the unfortunate necessity at Broken Arrow Canyon. "You knew," Eli said, turning to face Doc Harrison in the present. "You were part of it from the beginning." Doc Harrison's shoulders sagged, and for the first time since Eli had known him, the old physician looked every day of his age. "I was young, ambitious. They promised me a position as territorial medical examiner, a chance to practice real medicine instead of treating gunshot wounds and setting broken bones in mining camps. So you helped them plan a massacre," Sarah said, her voice cold with disgust. "I convinced myself it was necessary," Doc replied, his hand shaking again. "The territory needed the mineral wealth. The Cheyenne were standing in the way of progress. And they assured me it would be quick, clean, just a show of force to encourage relocation." "But it wasn't," Private Wells said. "No, it wasn't." Doc's voice broke. "When Morrison struck that woman, when the sacred stones were broken and that thing came crawling out of the earth, none of us had expected that. The creature killed half your men before you could drive it back, and then it marked all of you. The plan had been to blame the Cheyenne deaths on disease. But suddenly, we had soldiers bearing supernatural marks and telling stories about monsters." Joseph Running Bear drew deeply on the peace pipe, and the smoke vision shifted to show the aftermath of the Canyon Massacre. Eli watched in horror as he saw Doc Harrison working frantically to develop a cover story that would satisfy both the territorial government and the federal authorities who would inevitably investigate. The solution had been elegant and terrible. The survivors would be quietly transferred to different postings, sworn to secrecy under threat of court-martial for cowardice in the face of the enemy. The Cheyenne deaths would be attributed to a cholera outbreak, and anyone who died later from the supernatural mark would be listed as a casualty of frontier hardships. "Silverbrook Camp," Eli said, understanding flooding through him. "When the marks started killing people there, you knew exactly what was happening." "I thought I could contain it," Doc said desperately. "Study it, maybe find a cure. But when I arrived at Silverbrook and saw what the hunger had done to those miners," he shuddered, "I realized the creature had grown stronger, learned to manipulate its environment. It had turned the entire camp into a feeding ground." From his medical bag, Doc Harrison withdrew a leather portfolio that Eli had never seen before. Inside were documents bearing official seals, correspondence with territorial authorities, and, most damning of all, a signed agreement between Governor Crawford, Harrison Blackwood, and a consortium of mining interests that explicitly outlined the plan to eliminate the Cheyenne presence at Broken Arrow Canyon by whatever means necessary. "This is why you've been so helpful," Sarah said, her teacher's mind putting the pieces together. "Why you've been researching the mark, why you came to Silverbrook, why you've stayed in this frontier town instead of pursuing the career they promised you. You've been trying to atone. For 15 years, I've been trying to find a way to undo what we did," Doc confirmed. "But the creature, the hunger, it feeds on guilt and complicity. My involvement in the original plan has made it stronger, not weaker. Outside the schoolhouse, the creatures of Silverbrook Camp had begun to retreat, pulling back toward the mountains as the dawnlight grew stronger. But Eli knew this wasn't victory. It was just the hunger gathering its strength for what was to come. Joseph Running Bear set down the peace pipe and looked at each of them in turn. Now you see the full truth of what happened at Broken Arrow Canyon. It wasn't soldiers following orders. It was good men manipulated into serving evil purposes. The conspiracy that killed my father and unleashed the hunger reaches all the way to Washington, to men who see this land only as a source of wealth to be extracted. What does that mean for stopping the creature? Marshal Garrett asked. It means the binding cannot be restored by guilt alone, Joseph replied. The hunger has fed on your suffering for 15 years, but it has also fed on the lies that justified that suffering. To truly destroy it, we must expose the full truth of what was done and why. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the retreating forms of the walking dead. My father died trying to protect the sacred stones. You have spent 15 years believing you were guilty of murder. But the real murderers are the men who planned it all, the men who turned honorable soldiers into unknowing instruments of genocide. Blackwood, Eli said. Governor Crawford. The consortium. They're still alive, Sarah realized. Still profiting from the mineral rights they gained through mass murder. Joseph nodded grimly. And until they face justice for their crimes, the hunger will continue to grow stronger. It feeds on more than guilt now. It feeds on the unpunished evil that created it. For the first time in 15 years, Eli understood the full scope of what they were facing. The supernatural creature was only part of the problem. The real enemy was the human conspiracy that had created it. The men who had used good soldiers as tools of genocide and then hidden behind lies and classification stamps to avoid consequences. Then we exposed them, he decided. All of them. We returned to Broken Arrow Canyon, not just to restore the sacred stones, but to gather evidence of what really happened. And then we make sure the world knows the truth. The mark on his face pulsed. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a brand of guilt. It felt like a call to justice that had been 15 years in the making. The journey to Broken Arrow Canyon began at dawn, with 17 survivors from Calico Ridge following Eli and his former soldiers into the high country. Joseph Running Bear led the way, his weathered hands holding the reins of a paint horse that seemed to know paths invisible to everyone else as they rode higher into the mountains. The marks on the faces of the surviving cavalrymen began to change. No longer the twisted symbols of guilt and punishment they'd borne for 15 years. They transformed into something that resembled war paint angular patterns that spoke of purpose rather than condemnation. The ancestors are preparing us, Joseph explained when Sarah asked about the transformation. The spirits of warriors who fought to protect the sacred places are lending their strength for what's coming. What was coming became clear as they crested the final ridge before Broken Arrow Canyon. Below them, the valley that had once held Chief Running Bear's village was occupied by something far worse than they'd expected. Harrison. Blackwood had not been idle during the 15 years since the massacre. The thin man in the expensive suit had transformed into something altogether more dangerous, a territorial governor in his own right, with a private army of men who wore the blue uniforms of federal marshals but bore the cold eyes of hired killers. Federal Marshal Service, Territorial Division. Sergeant Briggs read from the banners flying over their military-style encampment. Since when do federal marshals travel with artillery? Since they're not really federal marshals, Doc Harrison sighed grimly. His confession in the schoolhouse had aged him visibly, but it had also steadied his hands and cleared his voice. Blackwood's been building this operation for years. The mining rights to this canyon are worth millions enough to buy uniforms, badges, and the silence of men willing to follow orders without asking questions. Eli studied the encampment through his field glasses. Blackwood had positioned his men well, with clear fields of fire covering all approaches to the sacred stone circle at the canyon's heart. But more troubling were the preparations around the fay. Stones themselves, excavation equipment, surveying instruments, and what looked like explosive charges placed with mathematical precision around the ancient markers. They're going to destroy what's left of the circle, Sarah realized. Complete the job they started 15 years ago, and release the hunger fully into the world, Joseph added. His weathered face was grim with the weight of prophecy. My father's vision showed him this moment, the choice between justice and catastrophe. If the stones are completely destroyed, the creature will no longer need to feed slowly. It will consume everything in its path, growing stronger with each life it takes. Private Wells, the youngest of their group, studied the enemy positions with the eye of a soldier who'd learned tactics the hard way. We can't fight them straight up. They've got us outnumbered 3-1, and they're positioned on high ground with clear sight lines. We're not here to fight them, Eli said. We're here to expose them. Sarah, you still have your journal? Sarah patted the leather satchel she'd carried from Calico Ridge. Every word, every document, every vision from the peace pipe ceremony. But how does that help us against an army? Because the truth is more powerful than bullets, especially when it's backed by the spirits of the dead, Joseph said. He was preparing something from his medicine bundle, a mixture of paints made from clay and plant dyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The ancestors have been waiting 15 years for justice. They're not going to let a few hired guns stand in the way of it. As Joseph began painting symbols on their faces, not the marks of guilt they'd worn, but the war paint of warriors fighting for righteousness, the temperature in the canyon began to drop. Frost formed on the grass despite the summer heat, and the air filled with the sound of distant drums that beat in rhythm with their hearts. They're coming, Chaplain Cross said, his voice filled with wonder rather than fear. The Cheyenne warriors, who died defending this place. They're answering the call. Through the gathering mist, shapes began to form translucent at first, but growing more solid with each passing moment. Mounted warriors in traditional dress, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming with supernatural fire. At their head rode a figure Eli recognized, despite the 15 years that had passed since he'd last seen him. Chief running. Bear looked exactly as he had the day Lieutenant Morrison had struck down the elderly woman. Proud, wise, and infinitely sad. But now his eyes held something else, a promise of justice finally served. The chief approached Eli and spoke in English, his voice carrying the weight of the grave and the hope of redemption combined. Captain Mercer, you returned to face what was broken, but you do not come as conqueror this time. No, Chief, I come to make amends, to expose the men who used us as tools of murder, and to restore what we destroyed in our ignorance. Chief Running Bear studied Eli's face, taking in the transformed mark that now looked like a badge of honor rather than a brand of shame. The spirits have tested your heart for 15 years. They find you worthy of the chance to set things right. He turned to address the entire group, living and dead, white and Native American, united in purpose for the first time since the canyon had known peace. The men below seek to complete the desecration they began. They will destroy the sacred stones not from ignorance this time, but from greed. The evil they serve is different from the hunger. It is the evil of men who place profit above life, who see the sacred as nothing more than obstacles to wealth. Down in the canyon, Blackwood's men had noticed the gathering supernatural army. Shouts of alarm rose from their camp as weapons were readied and positions reinforced. But their bullets would pass harmlessly through spirits, and their military discipline was about to be tested by forces they'd never trained to face. Sarah opened her journal and began writing rapidly, recording everything she saw and heard. This story would survive regardless of what happened in the next few hours. She would make sure of that. "What's the plan?" Marshal Garrett asked, checking his revolver out of old habit. Eli looked down at the canyon where so much blood had been spilled, where good men had been tricked into evil acts, where the sacred had been broken by ignorance and greed. But now, for the first time in 15 years, he saw not just the site of his greatest failure, but the place where redemption might finally be possible. "We tell the truth," he said simply. "All of it. We let the dead speak for themselves. We expose the conspiracy that created this horror, and we trust that justice, real justice, is stronger than the forces arrayed against it." The war paint on his face blazed with supernatural fire as he raised his cavalry saber one last time. Around him, the spirits of warriors who had died defending the sacred were preparing for a battle that would determine whether truth or lies would write the final chapter of Broken Arrow Canyon's bloody history. In the distance, thunder rolled across a cloudless sky, and every clock in the territory began striking an hour that existed on no earthly timepiece. The hour when the debt of justice comes due at last. The battle began not with gunfire, but with truth. As the combined forces of living survivors and Cheyenne spirits descended into Broken Arrow Canyon, a supernatural fire erupted at the center of the sacred stone circle. The flames burned without fuel, casting light that revealed not just the physical world, but the moral weight of every soul present. In that pitiless illumination, Harrison Blackwood's hired killers found themselves unable to hide behind their badges and uniforms. The sacred fire revealed them as they truly were: men who had sold their honor for gold, who wore the symbols of justice while serving the cause of greed. But it was Blackwood himself who suffered the fire's most devastating revelation. The thin man in the expensive suit tried to run as the flames spread, but the fire followed him, surrounding him in a pillar of light that forced him to face every decision he'd made in his climb to power. The sacred flames showed him as a young clerk in a Washington office, taking his first bribe to alter a surveyor's report. They showed him engineering the transfer of Captain Mercer and his men to Colorado Territory, knowing exactly what orders he planned to give them. They showed him counting the gold that flowed from Broken Arrow Canyon's mines while Cheyenne children starved on barren reservation land. "You planned it all," Eli said, his voice carrying across the canyon as he faced Blackwood in the circle of sacred fire. "Every death, every broken family, every man who died bearing the mark of guilt for crimes you orchestrated." Blackwood tried to speak, to offer justifications or denials, but the sacred flames stole his words. In their light, lies became impossible. Only truth could be spoken, and Blackwood's truth was uglier than anyone had imagined. The fire revealed documents that existed only in Blackwood's memory, correspondence with Eastern financiers who had promised him vast wealth in exchange for clearing Native Americans from mineral-rich lands. Letters to War Department officials who had agreed to provide military support for territorial pacification efforts. Contracts with men like Lieutenant Morrison, who had been specifically chosen not for their honor, but for their willingness to follow extreme orders without question. Morrison knew? Sarah gasped, her journal forgotten in her hands as she watched the revelations unfold. Morrison was recruited. The sacred fire revealed through Blackwood's forced confession. A young officer with gambling debts and a violent temper. We gave him money to pay his creditors and orders that would let him express his anger with official sanction. Chief Running Bear's spirit moved through the sacred flames without being burned, his presence adding weight to the supernatural tribunal that was finally judging the architects of genocide. 37 of my people died that day. Women, children, elders who had lived their entire lives in peace. You killed them for rocks and metal buried in the earth. The territory needed development. Blackwood tried to argue, but the sacred fire stripped away his justifications, revealing the simple greed beneath. The mineral wealth could have built schools, hospitals, infrastructure, built on the bones of murdered children. Joseph Running Bear said, his living voice joining his father's spirit. built with blood money and justified by lies. Around the sacred circle, Blackwood's hired gunmen were facing their own moments of truth. Some threw down their weapons and fled, unable to bear what the flames revealed about their own complicity. Others, more hardened by years of violence, raised their guns and fired at the spirits of Cheyenne warriors. The bullets passed harmlessly through their supernatural targets and struck the sacred stones behind them. Each impact sent cracks through the ancient markers, and with every crack, something else stirred in the depths beneath the canyon floor. The hunger was waking up. It rose from the broken earth like a living shadow. 15 years of feeding on guilt and resentment having transformed it into something vast and terrible. No longer the relatively small creature that had emerged during the original massacre. It now towered over the canyon like a nightmare made flesh. But the sacred fire revealed the hunger's truth as well, that it was not the ancient evil Joseph's ancestors had originally bound beneath the stones. It was something new, something born from the intersection of supernatural forces and human corruption. The original binding had contained a natural predator, something dangerous, but part of the world's balance. The creature that now loomed over them was an abomination, fed by the lies and unpunished crimes of men like Blackwood until it had grown beyond all natural limits. You created this, Eli realized, his sword raised against both human and supernatural enemies. Your conspiracy, your lies, your unpunished crimes, you turned a contained threat into something that could destroy everything. The hunger spoke then, its voice a chorus of every person who had died because of Blackwood's schemes. Miners who had worked themselves to death, extracting wealth from sacred ground. Native Americans who had starved on reservations while their ancestral lands were stripped bare. Soldiers who had died bearing marks of guilt for crimes they hadn't chosen to commit. Feed me more, the creature demanded, reaching toward the living with claws made of crystallized greed and hardened malice. 15 years of guilt was just the appetizer. Now I want the feast of despair that comes when good people realize their entire world is built on lies. But as the hunger reached for them, something unexpected happened. The war paint on the faces of Eli and his fellow soldiers blazed with light that matched the sacred fire. The marks that had branded them as guilty for 15 years transformed completely, becoming symbols of warriors who had chosen justice over comfort, truth over safety. You have no power over them anymore, Chief Running Bear declared, his spirit form becoming more solid as the sacred fire burned brighter. They have faced the truth of what was done in their names. They have chosen to stand with the victims, rather than hide behind the lies of their commanders. The hunger shrieked in fury and pain as its primary source of nourishment. The guilt of good men manipulated into evil acts was suddenly cut off. It had grown fat on 15 years of self-recrimination and shame, but redemption freely chosen was poison to its nature. Blackwood, seeing his supernatural ally weakening, drew a pistol and aimed it at Sarah, who was still frantically recording everything in her journal. None of this matters if no one lives to tell the story, he snarled. But before he could fire, Doc Harrison stepped between them. The old physician, his hand steady for the first time in years, met Blackwood's eyes without flinching. I helped you plan this atrocity, Doc said clearly. I provided the medical justification for your lies, and I've spent 15 years trying to atone for that choice. But my guilt ends here. He struck Blackwood's gun aside with his medical bag, and in the sacred fire's light, everyone could see the transformation that had taken place in the old doctor. The weight of years and shame had fallen away, replaced by the calm dignity of a man who had finally chosen to do the right thing regardless of the cost. The sacred fire pulsed once, acknowledging his choice, and began to spread beyond the stone circle. The final battle for Broken Arrow Canyon had begun, and for the first time in 15 years, justice was winning. The sacred fire spread across Broken Arrow Canyon like a living thing, touching everything and everyone, demanding truth from the living and justice for the dead. Where it touched the earth, flowers bloomed that had been extinct since the massacre ghost. Flowers, the Cheyenne called them, which only grew in soil sanctified by honest grief. Eli felt the fire wash over him, but instead of burning, it filled him with a warmth he hadn't experienced since childhood, the feeling of being precisely where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was born to do. In his hand, his cavalry saber transformed, its plain steel blade becoming something that seemed forged from starlight and righteous anger. The hunger, deprived of its primary food source, began to change as well. But instead of growing stronger, it started to collapse in on itself. 15 years of stolen guilt and manufactured shame no longer available to sustain its unnatural size. The creature that had towered over the canyon moments before was shrinking, becoming something that looked almost pitiful in the sacred fire's light. "It's dying," Joseph Running Bear observed, wonder in his voice. "When the lies that fed it are burned away, it returns to what it was originally, a natural predator that can be contained, not the abomination it became." But Blackwood wasn't finished. Seeing his supernatural ally weakening, he pulled explosive charges from his coat, the same charges his men had positioned around the remaining sacred stones. "If I can't have this canyon, no one can," he snarled, his finger on the detonator. "I'll bring down the entire mountainside before I let you expose what happened here." That was when Sarah Chun proved she was more than just a schoolteacher from San Francisco, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had studied more than just reading and writing. She struck the detonator from Blackwood's hand with a wooden ruler that blazed with sacred fire. In the supernatural light, everyone could see the truth she'd hidden even from herself, that she was the granddaughter of Soaring Eagle, a Cheyenne warrior who had escaped the massacre at Broken Arrow Canyon and spent his remaining years working to preserve the stories of his people. "My grandfather told me what really happened here," she said, her voice carrying new authority. "He made me promise that if the truth ever had a chance to be heard, I would make sure it survived." From her journal, she pulled out pages covered not just with her own handwriting, but with symbols and drawings that were clearly much older her grandfather's account of the massacre, preserved in pictographs that told the story of betrayal and heroism, of sacred places defiled and innocent blood spilled for gold. "Every word is documented," she continued, her teacher's voice reaching even the fleeing members of Blackwood's army. "Every confession forced by the sacred fire, every revelation about the conspiracy that planned this genocide. The world will know the truth." The redemption stone began to form, then a crystal that grew from the earth where Eli's tears of genuine repentance had fallen during the sacred fire's revelation. It pulsed with gentle light, marking the exact spot where guilt had finally transformed into acceptance of responsibility, where shame had become determination to make amends. Chief Running Bear's spirit approached the stone and placed his translucent hand upon it. "This is what was needed," he said, his voice filled with the peace that comes when justice is finally served. Not the blood of revenge, but the tears of genuine sorrow and the promise of lasting change. The hunger, now reduced to its original size and nature, retreated willingly into the restored sacred circle. The ancient binding, strengthened by truth freely spoken and responsibility willingly accepted, would hold it safely contained, not imprisoned in suffering, but balanced within the natural order as it had been before human greed had corrupted its purpose. But there was still Blackwood to deal with. The architect of genocide stood alone now, his hired army fled or converted by the sacred fire's revelations. In the supernatural light, he looked exactly like what he was, a small, greedy man whose hunger for wealth had consumed everything noble about him. "You've destroyed everything," he said to Eli, his voice breaking with the self-pity of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. 40 years of work, of building something that mattered. You built it on graves. Eli interrupted, his transformed sword pointing at Blackwood's heart. On the bones of children and the tears of their mothers. On the guilt of good men tricked into serving evil purposes. I gave those men purpose, Blackwood protested. I gave the territory wealth and progress. You gave us 15 years of nightmares and a supernatural creature that nearly destroyed everything we touched. Sergeant Briggs said, his own war paint blazing as he stepped forward with his fellow survivors. You turned honorable soldiers into unknowing tools of murder. The sacred fire pulsed brighter, and in its light, Blackwood began to age rapidly. The supernatural flames burned away his illusions, his justifications, and finally his very life, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of a soul that had fed too long on evil and had nothing left to sustain it when the lies were stripped away. He crumbled to dust that scattered on the wind, leaving behind only his expensive clothes and a briefcase full of documents that would serve as evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. In the silence that followed, the spirits of the Cheyenne who had died at Broken Arrow Canyon began to fade, their need for justice finally satisfied. Chief Running Bear was the last to go, pausing to speak with his son Joseph and with the soldiers who had once been his enemies. The circle is complete, he said simply. The truth has been spoken. The dead have been honored, and the living have chosen justice over comfort. The sacred places are protected now by something stronger than stone, and binding. They are protected by the commitment of those who have seen the cost of breaking them. He faded with the dawn light, leaving behind a canyon that looked exactly as it had 15 years ago, except for the crystal that marked the spot where redemption had grown from honest tears. The mark on Eli's face had completely transformed during the night's events. No longer a twisted symbol of guilt, it had become something that looked almost like a badge of honor, the sign of a man who had faced his worst failure and chosen to make it right, regardless of the cost. Justice had been served, truth had been spoken, and the sacred places were safe. But the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the confrontation at Broken Arrow Canyon, Sarah Chun sat in her new office in Denver, surrounded by boxes of documents, testimonies, and evidence that would change how the American frontier was remembered. The small brass nameplate on her door read, Sarah E. Chun, Territorial Historical Commission. But the work she was doing went far beyond preserving history. She was ensuring that truth would outlast the men who had tried to bury it. Her published account, The Hidden War, Genocide, and Conspiracy in the Colorado Territory, had created a sensation from Washington to San Francisco. Eastern newspapers called it the most important piece of investigative journalism since the Civil War. Western politicians denounced it as sensationalism and demanded congressional hearings to examine her evidence. They got their hearings, but not the kind they'd expected. The documents recovered from Blackwood's briefcase, combined with the testimonies of the surviving soldiers and corroborating evidence from government archives, painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial administration. Governor Crawford had resigned in disgrace and fled to Mexico. 3 territorial judges had been impeached, and the mining consortium that had financed the genocide faced criminal charges and civil lawsuits that would bankrupt them within the year. But Sarah's most important work wasn't the expose of government corruption. It was the memorial she was building at Broken Arrow Canyon. The site was now protected as sacred ground, with Joseph Running Bear serving as its first official guardian. The Cheyenne Nation had been granted permanent rights to the canyon, along with reparations that would fund schools and hospitals for generations to come. But more than that, it had become a place where people came to understand the cost of choosing expedience over justice, profit over human dignity. The memorial itself was simple, a circle of restored stones surrounding the redemption crystal. that had grown from Eli's tears. Each stone bore the name of a person who had died in the original massacre, carved in both English and Cheyenne. But it also held the names of the soldiers who had carried the mark of guilt for 15 years, acknowledging their transformation from unknowing tools of genocide to champions of truth. Eli Mercer's name was first among them. He had not lived to see the memorial's dedication. 3 days after the confrontation at the canyon, his heart had simply stopped, not from supernatural causes, but from the simple exhaustion of a man who had carried an impossible burden for 15 years and had finally been allowed to set it down. But his death had been peaceful, surrounded by the men who had served under him and the woman who had helped him find redemption. His last words, according to Doc Harrison, were, "Tell them the truth, all of it." Sarah had kept that promise. The other survivors had found their own ways to make amends. Sergeant Briggs had become a teacher at the Cheyenne School, funded by the reparations, helping young Native Americans learn to navigate the white man's world without losing their own culture. Private Wells had returned to Kansas and spent his remaining years as a circuit preacher, traveling from town to town with a message about the cost of following evil orders without question. Chaplain Cross had perhaps made the greatest change. He'd renounced his Army commission and joined Joseph Running Bear as a guardian of the sacred sites, devoting his life to ensuring that the spiritual significance of places like Broken Arrow Canyon was respected and protected. Even Doc Harrison had found peace. His confession and testimony had been crucial in exposing the medical cover-ups that had hidden the conspiracy's crimes, and his willingness to face consequences for his role had earned him a form of redemption. He'd returned to practicing medicine in small frontier towns, but now he refused payment from patients who couldn't afford it and donated half his earnings to Native American health initiatives. The work wasn't finished. Sarah's investigation had revealed that the Broken Arrow Canyon massacre was just one of dozens of similar incidents across the frontier. Systematic campaign of genocide disguised as territorial development and justified by lies about savage attacks and defensive necessity. But now there was a framework for seeking justice. Sarah's commission had been granted broad powers to investigate historical crimes, and similar bodies were being established in other territories. The truth was spreading, carried by people who had learned that some things mattered more than comfort or career advancement. On quiet evenings in her Denver office, Sarah would sometimes take out the journal she'd started that first night in Eli's cabin. The pages chronicled not just the supernatural events at Broken Arrow Canyon, but the very human story of how good people could be manipulated into serving evil purposes, and how they could choose to make amends when they finally understood what had been done in their names. The journal would become a book, not just a historical account that had already changed territorial politics, but something more personal. A story about guilt and redemption, about the cost of following orders without question, and about the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. She titled it, "The Mark of Justice, a Frontier Reckoning," and it would be read in schoolrooms and churches across America for generations to come. But perhaps the most important legacy of the events at Broken Arrow Canyon was the change in how young soldiers were trained. New regulations required officers to refuse illegal orders, even from their superiors. Military academies now taught courses on the moral responsibilities of leadership, using the Broken Arrow massacre as a case study in how good men could be turned into instruments of evil when they valued obedience over conscience. The mark that had once branded men as guilty now served as a reminder that every person with authority, whether military, political, or moral, had a responsibility to question orders that violated basic human dignity. On the first anniversary of the Canyon confrontation, Sarah made the journey back to Broken Arrow to place flowers on the memorial and visit with Joseph Running Bear. The old Cheyenne guardian had aged visibly during the year, but his eyes held the peace that comes from seeing justice finally served. "The spirits are quiet now," he told her as they stood beside the redemption stone. They no longer walk the canyon calling for vengeance. They rest with their ancestors, knowing that their deaths were not meaningless. Sarah nodded, her own heart finally at peace. The nightmares that had plagued her since that night in the schoolhouse had faded, replaced by dreams of the school children she would teach in the years to come, children who would grow up knowing that truth was more important than comfort, that justice was worth personal sacrifice, and that the sins of the past could be redeemed by those brave enough to face them honestly. As the sun set over Broken Arrow Canyon, painting the sacred stones with golden light, Sarah Chun understood that some stories never truly end. They become part of the land itself, part of the ongoing conversation between past and future, between the choices people make and the consequences they leave for their children. The mark of justice would endure, not as supernatural punishment, but as a human commitment to remember the cost of choosing convenience over conscience, profit over people, and expedience over truth. Some mistakes follow you no matter how far you run or how deep you bury them. But redemption follows too, patient and persistent, waiting for the moment when truth becomes more important than comfort, when justice matters more than peace, and when the courage to face the past finally outweighs the fear of what that honesty might cost. In Broken Arrow Canyon, where sacred stones stood guard over an ancient balance restored, that moment had finally come.